Chances are you're running a virtual machine at some point as a learning exercise. Now, I like to admit that majority of us are probably using something like VirtualBox for reasons of economics. As an example, Windows Hypervisor may be in some ways better in places, but it doesn't come free. Same with VMware, it is probably a much better hypervisor, and arguably so, but again, unless you're running server hardware, it's not really very economical for testing. So, today we're going to talk about VirtualBox and how it can be benefited by putting a wrapper around it of additional commands, as an example, PowerShell or any other kind of command line scripting. So we'll start with the basics. If you have a already imported virtual machine image, one of the first things you want to do is be able to import that from a command line and not always through the GUI. So that's a very simple process of using the VirtualBox Manager import command, then specifying the file name and an additional parameter or two. In this case, the additional parameter is the machine name I want to give my imported image. Now, as this runs the import, you can see there is a list of alternative commands I could also use, such as changing network, CPU, RAM. So these are all particularly useful if you're importing an image. And to be honest, you can create your own images. I certainly did. And for that, it means creating a base image like a Linux machine with the install, and then you're able to use that later to just copy and clone. Now here I've gone and created the machine and imported it from an image, and we can see that the machine is now there. Next we're going to do something a bit more complicated. So now let's use an example of PowerShell wrapping around the command line parameters in order to create something a bit more complex and simplify this in the process. So I've created a function called getVM. It has two parameters, the Windows/Linux OS parameter, which then determines which image we're going to use, and the name parameter, which we saw earlier with the command line as to how that gets put into the virtual machine. And then it's going to go ahead, modify my network so that I get onto my lab network that I created earlier, and also boot the VM. So this is going to be a relatively straightforward and simple process. I'm going to put in my function name, I'm going to put in the name of the VM that I want to create, and I'm going to specify the OS that I'm going to use. In this case, that's a Linux OS, so it's going to be my favorite, Ubuntu. And from that, I'm just going to go ahead and boot it immediately afterwards. So you can see the same as before, same output that we had with our previous command line parameters. But in this case, it's now going to just simply load it and do the additional steps that otherwise I would need to remember each and every time that I create a VM from one of these images. Now realistically, any scripting language could be used to create such a module. As an example, you could use Python, you could use Bash, you could use Batch. Any of these really would work. It's not a problem per se. In my case, I happen to use PowerShell for two reasons, well technically three, but the main reason for this is that courtesy of PowerShell 6, it's now supported on both Linux, Windows, and even Mac, so it allows me to reuse my module everywhere. And that concludes our brief example of how to put a wrapper around VirtualBox machine provisioning. Now, if you found this video useful, please give us a like or subscribe. I plan to do more of these in future.